The small, dusty courtroom was alive with murmurs and restless shuffling. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden benches filled with curious onlookers. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a scent that seemed to echo the weight of the law itself. At the center of it all stood Samuel Johnson, an elderly black man with deep lines etched into his face like the rings of an ancient tree. His hands, calloused from years of labor, clutched a worn leather Bible tightly against his chest. He wore a faded suit that had seen better days, its cuffs frayed and its color dulled by time. Yet despite his modest appearance, there was something about Samuel, a quiet strength in the way he held himself, that made people pause. Around him, the room buzzed with whispers. Most of the spectators had come expecting a quick resolution to what they assumed would be an open and shut case. On one side sat the representatives of a wealthy real estate developer, sharp-suited lawyers armed with stacks of documents, confident smiles, and expensive watches glinting under the fluorescent lights. They represented the kind of power money could buy, power that seemed insurmountable when compared to the lone figure standing before them. Across the aisle, a few townsfolk had gathered to support Samuel, though their numbers were dwarfed by the crowd backing the developer. Some whispered among themselves, shaking their heads as if already mourning the outcome. Others exchanged smirks or stifled chuckles, certain that this frail old man didn't stand a chance. Samuel's story began long before this day in court. Decades earlier, he had purchased the land at the edge of town, a modest plot surrounded by fields and dotted with wildflowers. It wasn't much back then, just a patch of earth waiting for someone willing to put in the work. For Samuel, it became everything. With every ounce of energy he possessed, he transformed the barren stretch into a thriving homestead. He built a small house with his own hands, brick by brick, while his wife planted flowers along the pathway leading to the front door. Together, they turned the soil, planting rows of corn, tomatoes, and okra. 2 towering oak trees marked the entrance to the property, their branches stretching skyward like guardians watching over the family below. Over the years, the land bore witness to countless milestones. It was where Samuel's children took their first steps, stumbling across the soft grass as he cheered them on. It was where his daughter learned to ride a bike, wobbling down the dirt path until she finally found her balance. And it was where his wife, Mary, tended her beloved garden, humming hymns as she worked. When tragedy struck and Mary passed away unexpectedly, Samuel buried her beneath one of the oak trees. Her memory lived on in every bloom that sprouted and every breeze that rustled the leaves above her resting place. For Samuel, the land wasn't just property. It was a tapestry woven with memories, love, and sacrifice. But progress, as it often does, came knocking. One crisp autumn morning, a letter arrived in Samuel's mailbox. Inside was an offer from a prominent real estate company eager to purchase his land. They wanted to build luxury homes, promising Samuel more money than he'd ever dreamed of earning. At first, he laughed at the absurdity of it all. "This land ain't for sale," he told anyone who asked. But the offers kept coming, each one larger than the last. Then, without warning, the tone shifted. Lawyers began showing up at his doorstep, their briefcases full of papers claiming the company had partial rights to the property due to some obscure legal technicality. When Samuel refused to budge, they filed a lawsuit, dragging him into a battle he never wanted. Now, here he was, standing in a courtroom facing opponents who seemed untouchable. As the judge entered and called the session to order, Samuel felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain steady. He glanced around the room, taking in the sea of unfamiliar faces. Some looked sympathetic. Others appeared amused, as if they were watching a mismatched fight between a lion and a lamb. Samuel knew they underestimated him. They saw an old man, uneducated in the ways of the law, trying to go toe-to-toe with corporate giants. What they didn't see was the fire burning inside him, the same fire that had driven him to build a life from nothing, to protect his family, and to honor the legacy of the woman he loved. As the proceedings began, the opposing counsel wasted no time. launching into their case. Their voices were smooth and practiced, dripping with authority as they presented document after document to prove their claim. Charts and maps were displayed on a projector screen, highlighting alleged discrepancies in the property boundaries. Expert witnesses took the stand, speaking in technical jargon that left most of the audience nodding along without fully understanding. Each piece of evidence was delivered with precision, designed to overwhelm and intimidate. To many in the room, it seemed like an avalanche of facts too great for Samuel to overcome. The crowd reacted predictably. Murmurs of approval rippled through the gallery as the developers' team laid out their arguments. People nodded knowingly, impressed by the sheer volume of information being presented. A few even laughed softly, sharing jokes about how hopeless Samuel's situation appeared. One young woman leaned over to her companion and whispered, "He doesn't even have a lawyer. What's he going to do?" Her words hung in the air, reflecting the sentiment of the majority. Samuel stood silently throughout, his expression unreadable. Occasionally he adjusted his glasses or shifted his weight from one foot to the other, but otherwise, he gave no sign of the storm brewing within him. When it came time for Samuel to speak, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to him as he stepped forward, his movement slow but deliberate. He cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly as he began. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge, "I ain't got no fancy papers or big words to throw around. I'm just a simple man trying to tell my truth." The initial nervousness in his voice elicited a few snickers from the gallery, but Samuel didn't falter. Instead, he paused, drawing a deep breath as if gathering strength from somewhere deep inside. Then, with surprising clarity, he continued, "This land ain't just dirt and rocks. It's where I've lived my whole life, where my wife is buried, where my grandbabies play. You can take away my house, but you can't take away what this place means to me." His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. For a moment, the courtroom seemed frozen in time. Even the skeptical faces softened as Samuel spoke, his voice growing steadier with each sentence. He described the long nights spent fixing fences after storms, the early mornings tending crops before the sun rose, and the weekends teaching his grandchildren the value of hard work. He talked about Mary, her laughter echoing through the fields as she watered her plants, and how her absence still lingered in every corner of the land. By the time he finished, the atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. No longer were people laughing or whispering dismissively. Instead, they sat quietly, captivated by the raw honesty of a man fighting not just for property, but for something far greater, a lifetime of love, loss, and resilience. Though Samuel's turn to speak was over, the impact of his words lingered, long after he stepped back. The laughter that had once echoed through the courtroom now felt distant, almost shameful. In its place was a profound silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers or the creak of a chair. The opposing counsel tried to regain control of the narrative, presenting more evidence and calling additional witnesses to bolster their case. But their arguments, once so convincing, now felt hollow. The slick presentations and technical jargon couldn't compete with the authenticity of Samuel's testimony. Even the judge, who had remained impassive throughout most of the trial, seemed visibly moved, occasionally nodding as if acknowledging the depth of what she had just heard. Outside the courthouse, the story spread quickly. Reporters who had initially dismissed the case as a routine legal dispute suddenly scrambled to interview Samuel. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward him, and questions came rapid fire. "How did you prepare for today? What do you think your chances are? What message do you have for others in similar situations?" Samuel answered calmly, his responses measured and thoughtful. "I didn't prepare no speech," he admitted, smiling faintly. "I just told the truth. Sometimes truth speaks louder than money." His words resonated deeply, not just with those present but with anyone who heard the story later. It was a reminder that justice isn't always about winning. It's about standing firm in what you believe, no matter the odds. And as Samuel walked away from the courthouse, his head held high, he carried with him not just the hope of victory, but the knowledge that he had spoken his truth to the world. The courtroom fell silent as Samuel stepped back to his seat, his words still hanging in the air like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. The opposing counsel, momentarily caught off guard by the emotional weight of Samuel's testimony, quickly tried to regain their footing. They shuffled through their papers with exaggerated precision, clearing their throats and exchanging hurried whispers. It was clear they hadn't anticipated this turn of events. Their confidence, once unshakable, now seemed brittle, like glass on the verge of cracking. One of the lawyers stood up, smoothing his tie before addressing the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but lacking its earlier swagger. "While Mr. Johnson's sentiments are certainly heartfelt, they do not change the legal realities of this case." He launched into another round of arguments, presenting more documents, and citing obscure laws that supposedly proved their claim to part of Samuel's land. Charts were displayed again, showing property lines redrawn in ways that favored the developer. Expert witnesses returned to the stand, reiterating points about zoning regulations and historical surveys. But something had shifted. The crowd, which had previously nodded along or chuckled dismissively, now seemed restless. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with one another. Some even glanced at Samuel, who sat quietly with his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. Despite the developer's best efforts, their arguments felt hollow compared to the raw honesty Samuel had delivered. Every time the lawyer said legal technicality or property rights, it sounded increasingly hollow, like an echo bouncing off empty walls. Even the judge appeared less engaged, her pen moving slowly across her notepad as if she were only half listening. The contrast between Samuel's heartfelt plea and the cold logic of the opposition was stark, almost jarring. Where Samuel had spoken from the soul, the developers spoke from spreadsheets. And no matter how many charts they showed, or how many experts they called, they couldn't replicate the authenticity Samuel brought to the table. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in the room grew palpable. The opposing counsel, sensing their advantage slipping away, became more aggressive in their questioning. They focused on minor details, trying to poke holes in Samuel's narrative. "Mr. Johnson," one of them asked sharply, leaning forward, as if to intimidate him, "you mentioned building your house yourself. Can you provide any documentation proving ownership of the materials used, or perhaps receipts for permits during construction?" Samuel blinked slowly, unfazed by the attempt to rattle him. "No, sir," he replied calmly, his voice steady. "I didn't need no papers back then. I built it with my own 2 hands, sweat, and prayers. That's all the proof I got." The lawyer pressed further, asking about alleged discrepancies in the property boundaries. "Isn't it true," he continued, flipping through a folder dramatically, "that parts of this land were originally designated for public use decades ago? How can you claim full ownership when records suggest otherwise?" Samuel leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting the lawyer's without flinching. "Maybe so," he said softly. "But that don't change the fact that I've been taking care of this land longer than most folks here been alive. Ain't nobody else cared about it like I have. Ain't nobody else bled for it like I have." Each question seemed designed to undermine Samuel's credibility. Yet somehow he turned every challenge into an opportunity to reinforce his connection to the land. His answers weren't polished or rehearsed. They were raw, honest, and deeply personal. He spoke of the sacrifices he'd made, the storms he'd weathered, and the love he'd poured into every inch of the property. With each word, the developer's arguments lost more ground. What started as a battle over legalities had transformed into something far greater, a fight over values, memories, and what it means to truly own something. By the time the opposing counsel finished their presentation, the mood in the courtroom had shifted entirely. The initial confidence they exuded at the start of the day had evaporated, replaced by a sense of desperation. Their closing statement, intended to seal their victory, instead came across as hollow rhetoric. "Your Honor," the lead attorney concluded, gesturing broadly toward the evidence stacked neatly on the table, "the law is clear. We respectfully urge you to rule in favor of justice based on the facts presented." The word, justice, hung awkwardly in the air, sounding oddly out of place given the context. Justice, as Samuel had defined it, wasn't about paperwork or property lines. It was about honoring the ties that bind people to the places they call home. When it was Samuel's turn to make his final remarks, the room held its collective breath. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate but unhurried. This time there was no trembling in his voice, only quiet resolve. "I ain't gonna waste your time repeating what I already said," he began, looking directly at the judge. "But I will say this. Land ain't just something you buy and sell. It's where life happens, where love grows, where pain heals. For me, this land is family. And I reckon family's worth fighting for." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then, with a slight nod, he added, "That's all I got to say." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks stopped for a moment, struck by the simplicity and power of Samuel's message. Outside the courthouse, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and grass. Inside, the air felt heavy with anticipation as everyone waited for the judge's decision. Though Samuel had spoken his truth, the outcome remained uncertain. Yet regardless of the verdict, one thing was undeniable. Samuel Johnson had planted a seed that day, a reminder that sometimes the most compelling arguments aren't found in legal briefs or expert testimonies, but in the stories we carry within us. For the spectators filing out of the courtroom after the session adjourned, the experience lingered long after they left. Conversations buzzed outside the building, with people debating whether the judge would side with Samuel or the developers. Some believed the sheer force of Samuel's testimony might sway the ruling, while others thought the law would ultimately prevail. Regardless of individual opinions, one sentiment echoed loudly. Samuel had changed the narrative. No longer was this just a dispute over land. It had become a story about humanity, resilience, and the enduring power of truth. And though the final chapter had yet to be written, Samuel's courage ensured that his voice and his legacy would not be forgotten. The courtroom was eerily quiet as the judge prepared to deliver her verdict. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, as everyone leaned forward in their seats, straining to catch every word. Samuel sat perfectly still, his hands clasped tightly together on the table in front of him. His face remained calm, but his knuckles were white from gripping the edges of his worn Bible. Around him, the crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the moment that would decide not just the fate of a piece of land, but also the legacy of a man who had poured his life into it. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge began, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the silence like a knife. She glanced down at her notes before continuing. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented and the testimonies given, I find myself faced with a decision that balances legal principles with human realities." Her eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on Samuel before shifting to the opposing counsel. For a fleeting second, Samuel thought he saw something, a flicker of empathy perhaps in her expression. But he quickly dismissed the thought, reminding himself not to get his hopes up. The judge summarized the arguments made by both sides, acknowledging the developer's claims about property boundaries and historical records. She nodded as she referenced the charts, maps, and expert witnesses they had presented. "These documents are indeed compelling," she admitted, causing a ripple of anticipation among the spectators. Some of the developer's supporters exchanged hopeful glances, while others shifted uncomfortably, sensing an underlying tone they couldn't quite place. Then, without missing a beat, the judge turned her attention to Samuel's testimony. "But this court must also consider the human element of this case," she continued, her voice softening slightly. "Mr. Johnson has demonstrated a profound connection to the land in question, a connection rooted not in legal titles or financial transactions, but in decades of hard work, sacrifice, and love." The room seemed to freeze as she spoke, her words resonating deeply with everyone present. Even the opposing counsel appeared momentarily taken aback, their polished composure faltering under the weight of her statement. Samuel listened intently, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the judge's acknowledgement of his story didn't guarantee victory, but hearing those words aloud gave him a sense of validation he hadn't expected. The memories of his wife, Mary, flooded back, the way she used to sing while tending her garden, the laughter of their children playing in the fields, the quiet moments they shared beneath the oak trees. All of it felt alive again, as if the land itself were whispering encouragement in his ear. Finally, the judge reached her conclusion. While the law provides frameworks for resolving disputes, she said, pausing for effect, it does not exist in isolation from the lives it affects. In light of the evidence and the undeniable bond Mr. Johnson shares with this property, I rule in favor of the defendant. This land belongs to Samuel Johnson. The words landed like thunder, reverberating through the courtroom. For a moment there was complete silence, as if no one dared to believe what they had just heard. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the room, starting with a few hesitant claps before building into a wave of cheers. Samuel sat motionless, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring his vision as he stared at the judge in disbelief. A lump formed in his throat, making it impossible to speak. Around him, people stood up, clapping and shouting words of congratulations. Some of the townsfolk, who had come to support him, rushed forward, embracing him warmly. "You did it, Samuel," one woman exclaimed, her voice choked with emotion. "You showed them what real ownership means." Outside the courthouse, reporters jostled for position, eager to capture the historic ruling. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward Samuel, and questions came rapid fire. How does it feel to win? What message do you have for others facing similar battles? Will you sell the land now? Samuel raised a hand to quiet the chaos, his movements slow but deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same quiet strength that had defined his entire testimony. "It feels right," he said simply, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. This wasn't about money or power. It was about standing up for what's yours, not because the law says so, but because your heart knows it's true. His response sent ripples through the gathered audience, many of whom nodded in agreement. One young reporter, visibly moved, stepped forward and asked, "Do you think justice was served today?" Samuel smiled faintly, his weathered face lighting up with a mixture of pride and humility. "Justice ain't always about winning or losing," he replied. "Sometimes it's about telling your truth, even when nobody's listening, and sometimes folks hear you anyway." As the media frenzy continued, Samuel took a step back, retreating into the shadow of the courthouse steps. He needed a moment to process everything that had happened. The weight of the victory settled over him like a warm blanket, bringing both relief and exhaustion. He thought about Mary, wondering if she could somehow see him now, proud of the fight he had waged in her memory. He thought about his grandchildren, who would grow up knowing their family's roots ran deep in that soil. Most of all, he thought about the land itself, the fields, the trees, the dirt beneath his feet, and how it had always been more than just property. It was home. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, Samuel returned to his land. The familiar sights and sounds greeted him like old friends. The rustling leaves of the oak trees, the chirping crickets, the faint scent of wildflowers carried by the breeze. He walked slowly, taking it all in, letting the reality of the day sink in. For years he had feared losing this place, imagined waking up one morning to find bulldozers tearing apart the fields where his wife was buried. Now, thanks to the judge's ruling, that nightmare would never come true. But Samuel knew the fight wasn't entirely over. Developers were persistent, and he suspected they might appeal the decision or try other tactics to pressure him into selling. Still, for now, he allowed himself to savor the victory. As he stood beneath the towering oaks, he placed a hand on the trunk of one and whispered, "We did it, Mary." We held on. The wind stirred around him, carrying with it a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. Word of Samuel's triumph spread quickly throughout the town. Neighbors who had once doubted his chances stopped by to offer congratulations and share stories of their own struggles against big corporations. Some brought food, others offered help maintaining the property, and a few even volunteered to keep an eye out for any suspicious activity related to the developers. Samuel welcomed their support, grateful for the renewed sense of community that his case had inspired. Yet amidst the celebrations, Samuel remained grounded. He understood that his victory wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. It represented a rare instance where humanity triumphed over bureaucracy, where a simple man armed with nothing but his truth stood toe-to-toe with powerful adversaries and emerged victorious. People began to see him not just as Samuel Johnson, the farmer, but as a symbol of resilience and integrity. Strangers approached him at the grocery store or church, thanking him for reminding them of the importance of standing firm in their beliefs. Despite the newfound attention, Samuel stayed true to himself. He continued tending his crops, fixing fences and caring for the land as he always had. Life went on much the same as before, except now, whenever he looked out over his fields, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle may have been won, but the war, for justice, for dignity, for the right to live freely on one's own terms, was far from over. And Samuel knew that if called upon again, he would rise to meet the challenge, just as he had done this time. In the weeks that followed, Samuel became something of a local hero. Schools invited him to speak to students about perseverance and courage. Community groups organized events in his honor, using his story to inspire others to stand up for what they believed in. Even beyond the town limits, news outlets picked up the story, sharing it with audiences nationwide. Samuel's name became synonymous with hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit could shine brightly. Through it all, Samuel remained humble. "I didn't do nothing special," he often said when praised. "I just told my truth and trusted God to handle the rest." His modesty only endeared him further to those who admired him. They saw in him not just a victor, but a teacher, a living example of how authenticity and determination could overcome even the greatest challenges. And though the world moved on, chasing new headlines and fresh stories, Samuel's legacy endured, etched into the hearts of all who had witnessed his journey. The days following the court ruling brought a mix of emotions for Samuel Johnson. On one hand, there was an overwhelming sense of relief, a weight lifted from his shoulders that he hadn't fully realized was crushing him until it was gone. For years, the fear of losing his land had gnawed at him like a persistent ache, keeping him awake at night and shadowing his every thought during the day. Now, with the judge's decision firmly behind him, he could finally breathe easier. The fields, the oak trees, the soil beneath his feet, all of it still belonged to him. It was a victory not just for Samuel, but for everything the land represented: love, sacrifice, and resilience. Yet, despite the triumph, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that this battle wasn't truly over. He knew how relentless developers could be, how they often returned with new strategies or appeals when their initial plans failed. As much as he wanted to believe the ruling would put an end to the matter, he understood that powerful forces rarely backed down without a fight. So while he allowed himself moments of celebration, he remained vigilant, keeping one eye on the horizon for any signs of trouble. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the fields in hues of orange and gold, Samuel sat on the porch steps of his modest home. His granddaughter Lily sat beside him, her legs swinging back and forth as she chewed on a piece of grass. She was 10 years old, full of energy and curiosity, and fiercely proud of her grandfather. Since the trial, she had taken to calling him the hero, much to his amusement. That evening, she turned to him with wide eyes and asked, "Grandpa, are they going to come back? Those people who wanted our land?" Samuel sighed deeply, leaning forward to rest his elbows on his knees. He hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said finally, his voice soft but steady. "They might try something, but I reckon if they do, we'll handle it together, same way we always have." Lily nodded solemnly, as though she understood the gravity of his words, even though she was too young to grasp the full complexity of the situation. Still, her presence brought Samuel comfort. Knowing that future generations would inherit the land and all the stories it held, gave him strength. As the weeks passed, life on the property returned to its usual rhythm. Samuel tended to his crops, repaired broken fences, and spent hours walking the perimeter of the land, inspecting every inch as if to reassure himself it was still intact. Neighbors continued to visit, offering support and sharing tales of their own struggles against similar adversaries. Some brought food, others offered labor, and a few simply stopped by to sit and talk. These interactions reminded Samuel of the power of community, something he had sometimes overlooked in the solitude of his daily routines. Now, more than ever, he felt connected to the people around him, but the attention didn't stop at the town line. Word of Samuel's victory spread far beyond the small community, reaching newspapers, radio stations, and online platforms across the country. Reporters flocked to the area, eager to capture interviews with the man who had stood up to corporate greed and won. At first, Samuel found the sudden fame overwhelming. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the constant questions made him uneasy. Yet, over time, he grew accustomed to it, learning to navigate the media circus with the same quiet dignity that had defined his courtroom testimony. During one such interview, a journalist asked Samuel what advice he would give to others facing similar battles. Without hesitation, Samuel replied, "Don't let nobody tell you your story ain't worth hearing. You might not have fancy degrees or big bank accounts, but you got something better, your truth. And that's worth fighting for." His words resonated deeply, striking a chord with audiences who saw in Samuel a reflection of their own struggles. Letters poured in from strangers thanking him for inspiring them to stand firm in the face of adversity. Teachers shared his story in classrooms, activists cited him in speeches, and ordinary people whispered his name in conversations about justice and perseverance. Despite the widespread recognition, Samuel refused to let the attention change him. He declined offers to write a book, appear on television shows, or endorse products, explaining that he wasn't interested in turning his life into a spectacle. "This ain't about me," he told anyone who asked. "It's about the land and the folks who depend on it. If my story helps somebody else keep holding on, then that's enough for me." His humility only added to his appeal, drawing even more admiration from those who followed his journey. Back on the property, Samuel began making subtle improvements, determined to ensure the land remained productive and thriving for years to come. He planted new rows of vegetables, fixed the leaky roof on the barn, and cleared out overgrown sections of the field. Though his body ached from decades of hard work, he pushed through the pain, driven by a renewed sense of purpose. Each task became a form of gratitude, a way of honoring the place that had given him so much. One afternoon, as Samuel worked in the garden, a car pulled up along the dirt road leading to the house. Out stepped a man in a tailored suit, his polished shoes caked with dust after navigating the uneven terrain. Samuel recognized him immediately. It was one of the lawyers representing the developer. The sight sent a chill down his spine, but he forced himself to remain calm. Setting down his hoe, he wiped his hands on his pants and walked toward the visitor, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Johnson," the lawyer began, extending a hand. Samuel ignored the gesture, crossing his arms instead. "What do you want?" he asked bluntly, his tone firm but not aggressive. The lawyer hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to being met with such directness. "I'm here to discuss a revised proposal," he said cautiously, glancing around as if searching for backup. "My clients are willing to increase their offer significantly. Cash up front, no strings attached." Samuel stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tightening. Then slowly he shook his head. "You can tell your clients this," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "This land ain't for sale. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Money won't change my mind." The lawyer opened his mouth to argue, but Samuel cut him off. "Save your breath. I already told y'all once I'm not leaving. Now, unless you got something else to say, I suggest you turn around and leave my property." The lawyer lingered for a moment, perhaps hoping Samuel might reconsider. When it became clear that he wouldn't, the man climbed back into his car and drove away, leaving behind a cloud of dust. Samuel watched him go, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. He knew the developers wouldn't give up easily, but he also knew that he had faced worse challenges and emerged stronger each time. That night, as Samuel sat on the porch staring at the stars, he reflected on the day's events. The lawyer's visit had been unsettling, a reminder that the threat of loss still loomed overhead. Yet, instead of despair, Samuel felt a strange sense of peace. He realized that the battle for his land had taught him something invaluable. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Every challenge he had faced, from the initial lawsuit to the media frenzy to the lawyer's unexpected visit, had tested his strength and resolve. And each time he had risen to meet it. As the days turned into weeks, Samuel noticed subtle changes within himself. He felt lighter somehow, as if shedding the burden of doubt and uncertainty had freed him to live more fully. He spent more time with his grandchildren, teaching them the skills he had learned from his father and passing down the traditions that defined their family. He reconnected with old friends, mended strained relationships, and embraced the simple joys of everyday life. The land, once a source of anxiety, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where he could find solace and meaning. Still, Samuel remained aware of the larger implications of his victory. Beyond the personal stakes, his case had sparked conversations about land ownership, corporate greed, and the rights of ordinary citizens to protect their homes. Advocacy groups reached out to him, asking for permission to use his story to highlight broader issues affecting marginalized communities. Farmers, indigenous groups, and environmental activists rallied around his example, using his triumph as a rallying cry for their own causes. Samuel agreed to lend his voice to these efforts, understanding that his struggle was part of a much bigger fight. At rallies and community meetings, he spoke passionately about the importance of preserving land, not just for economic gain, but for cultural identity and ecological sustainability. Land is more than dirt and rocks, he often said. It's where memories are made, where families grow, where dreams take root. Once it's gone, you can't get it back. So we gotta fight to keep it alive. His message resonated deeply, earning him respect and admiration from unlikely quarters. Politicians cited his case in debates about property rights. Artists created works inspired by his resilience, and filmmakers approached him about adapting his story for the screen. Though Samuel politely declined most of these opportunities, he appreciated the impact his journey had on others. He saw it as proof that even the smallest acts of resistance could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond what anyone might expect. By the time autumn arrived, blanketing the fields in a patchwork of reds, yellows, and browns, Samuel felt a profound sense of contentment. The land was safe, for now, and he had played a role in. Winter arrived quietly, wrapping Samuel's land in a soft blanket of frost. The fields lay dormant, the trees stood bare, and the mornings were crisp with the kind of cold that made your breath visible in the air. Yet, despite the stillness, there was a warmth in Samuel's heart that no season could diminish. The victory in court had given him more than just legal ownership of his property. It had reignited his spirit, filling him with a renewed sense of purpose. Every day felt like a gift, a chance to live fully and deeply on the land he loved. Samuel spent his days tending to the small tasks that kept the farm running smoothly. He chopped firewood, repaired fences battered by autumn storms, and prepared the soil for spring planting. Though his body ached from years of labor, he moved with determination, finding joy in the rhythm of work. Each swing of the axe, each hammer strike against nails was a reminder that he was still here, alive, resilient, and unyielding. His hands, rough and calloused, told the story of a life built through hard work, and they continued to shape the land as if it were an extension of himself. As the holidays approached, Samuel opened his home to family and friends, welcoming them with open arms and hearty meals. The house buzzed with laughter and conversation, the scent of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread wafting through the air. Lily, now older and more curious than ever, peppered everyone with questions about the trial, eager to hear her grandfather's story retold. "Grandpa," she asked one evening over dinner, What was the scariest part of the whole thing? Samuel chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair as he thought about her question. The scariest part, he replied after a pause, was doubtin'. Doubtin' whether I'd done enough, whether I deserved to win, whether anyone would even listen. But then I realized something. It ain't about winning or losing. It's about standing up for what's right even when you're scared. His words hung in the air, resonating with everyone at the table. For Samuel, the battle had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. The weeks passed, and Samuel found himself reflecting not only on his own journey, but also on its impact on others. Letters continued to arrive from strangers across the country, sharing how his story had inspired them to face their own challenges. Some wrote about fighting to save their homes from foreclosure. Others described standing up to powerful corporations, threatening their livelihoods. One letter, written by a young woman named Rebecca, stood out. She explained that she had been struggling to keep her late father's small business afloat after developers tried to buy out the building. "Your story reminded me that I'm not alone," she wrote. "It gave me the strength to say no, and to believe that saying no is worth it." Reading these letters filled Samuel with a profound sense of gratitude. He hadn't set out to inspire anyone. He had simply wanted to protect his land. Yet somehow his fight had become a beacon of hope for people facing their own battles. It humbled him to think that his actions, however small they seemed, had touched so many lives. "Maybe that's why we go through hard times," he mused, aloud one evening while sitting by the fireplace. "So we can help somebody else get through theirs." Despite the admiration and respect he received, Samuel remained grounded. He avoided grand gestures and flashy displays, preferring instead to focus on the quiet, everyday acts that defined his character. When neighbors needed help fixing a barn or planting crops, he showed up without being asked. When local schools invited him to speak, he accepted humbly, using the opportunity to encourage students to value honesty and perseverance. And when reporters called seeking interviews, he politely declined most requests, explaining that his story belonged to the community, not to him alone. Yet, even as Samuel embraced his role as a symbol of resilience, he couldn't ignore the calm, lingering shadow of the developers. True to his suspicions, they hadn't given up. A few months after the ruling, another letter arrived, a formal notice announcing their intention to appeal the decision. The news sent a ripple of unease through the town, reigniting fears that the fight wasn't truly over. This time, however, Samuel faced the challenge with a calm assurance he hadn't possessed before. He knew the road ahead might be long and difficult, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. The support system around Samuel had grown stronger than ever. Neighbors formed committees to monitor the developers' activities. Volunteers offered legal assistance, and advocacy groups rallied behind him, determined to ensure justice prevailed. Even the judge who had ruled in Samuel's favor expressed confidence in the original decision, stating publicly that the case had set an important precedent for protecting individual rights against corporate interests. These developments bolstered Samuel's resolve, reminding him that the battle for his land was part of a larger movement for fairness and dignity. One chilly morning, as Samuel walked along the edge of the property, he noticed a group of teenagers gathered near the oak trees. They were planting saplings, their cheeks flushed from the cold, but their smiles bright with enthusiasm. When they saw him approaching, one of them stepped forward. "We heard about your story, Mr. Johnson," the boy said shyly. "We wanted to do something to help, so we're planting new trees. Figured it's our way of saying thanks." Samuel felt a lump rise in his throat. He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You kids don't know how much this means to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But remember, it ain't just about the trees. It's about what they stand for. Roots, growth, life. Take care of them and they'll take care of you." The teenagers nodded solemnly, promising to nurture the saplings until they grew tall and strong. As the months rolled by, Samuel began to see his victory not as the end of a chapter, but as the beginning of something greater. His story had sparked conversations about land rights, environmental conservation, and the importance of preserving cultural heritage. Farmers across the region started organizing to resist corporate encroachment, drawing inspiration from Samuel's example. Indigenous leaders cited his case in discussions about reclaiming ancestral lands, while activists used it to highlight the disproportionate impact of development projects on marginalized communities. Samuel's name became synonymous with resistance, a reminder that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they stood together. Despite the attention, Samuel never lost sight of what mattered most, the land itself. He continued to care for it with the same devotion he always had, treating it not as a possession but as a partner. Every sunrise brought new opportunities to connect with the earth, to feel its pulse beneath his feet, and hear its whispers in the wind. And every sunset reminded him of the beauty and fragility of life, the fleeting moments that made it all worthwhile. Years later, when Samuel finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family, the entire town mourned his loss. His funeral was held outdoors beneath the towering oaks where Mary was buried. Hundreds of people attended, spilling onto the fields and standing shoulder to shoulder in silent tribute. Speakers shared stories of Samuel's kindness, wisdom, and unwavering courage, painting a picture of a man who had left an indelible mark on everyone he met. At the end of the service, Lily stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "My grandpa taught me that the strongest roots aren't the ones you see above ground," she said. "They're the ones buried deep, holding everything together." That's who he was, a root for all of us. In the years that followed, Samuel's legacy lived on, not just in the stories people told, but in the actions they took. The saplings planted by the teenagers grew into sturdy trees, their branches reaching skyward like arms raised in celebration. Advocacy movements gained momentum, fueled by the memory of a simple man who had refused to back down. And the land itself remained vibrant, a testament to the love and labor poured into it by generations of Johnsons. Samuel's story became more than history. It became a living lesson, passed down from parent to child, neighbor to neighbor. It reminded people that true ownership wasn't measured in deeds or dollars, but in connection, sacrifice, and love. And though the world changed rapidly around them, the values Samuel embodied endured, rooted firmly in the hearts of those who carried his memory forward. On quiet evenings, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the fields glowed golden under the fading light, visitors would often stop by the property. They came to pay their respects, to sit beneath the oaks, and to listen to the rustle of leaves that seemed to whisper Samuel's name. In those moments, it was easy to believe that some spirits never truly leave, that they linger in the places they cherished, watching over the lives they touched. And perhaps, somewhere among the rustling leaves and swaying branches, Samuel smiled, knowing his fight had been worth it. After all, the land was safe, the roots were strong, and the truth had spoken louder than money ever could.